are watching World Insight. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on the show, the real situation on the ground of the Sino-African partnership. University of London study sets the record straight. That interview right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program coming to you live from Beijing. China has been Africa's most important partner, with trade growing at 20% each year. But some were quick to cast the Sino-African partnership in a negative light instead of determining the facts, the beneficial impact of Chinese investments on the African continent. Take a look at this report first.
Decades, China has been Africa's largest trading partner, with deep ties in trade, investment, infrastructure, and financing. But some critics find China's presence in Africa as a form of neo-colonialism. There were narratives that demonized China's presence in Africa, accusations of ensnaring African countries in the so-called debt trap, launching infrastructure projects that only employ Chinese workers, and complaints of little paid and lack of skilled training. The reports of the real situation on the ground, based on factual studies in recent years, reveal true stories beyond Sino-Africa relations. One of the most comprehensive reports was led by a professor from the University of London, which set the record straight.
And I was earlier joined by one of the authors of that report, Professor Carlos Oya from University of London, and Ali Khan Sachu, who is the CEO of Rich Management, and asked Professor Oya about his findings.
The proportion of local African workers in the workforce was much higher than usually assumed. For Ethiopia, we estimated that 90% of the total labor force was Ethiopian in Chinese firms. For Angola, it was about 75% on average for all the firms included. So much higher than the usual perceptions. And those who were not Angolans or Ethiopians were basically hired in positions of management, skilled labor, engineers, and so on. So what this also shows is that there are important differences between countries when you contrast Ethiopia and Angola. We basically compared companies from different origins within the same sector. So in Ethiopia, for example, we looked at light manufacturing, so textile and garment, as well as leather products, and that's for the manufacturing sector. And for construction infrastructure, we focused on road contractors. This is because road construction is one of the areas where Chinese firms have been particularly important in the Ethiopian and Angolan market, but also one area where you find companies of different origins also operating there.
Mr. Sachu, you've been listening attentively to your colleague talking about what he found out in the two countries. Now, is his impression or the result of his research comparable to your personal experiences in Africa?
Obviously, there's been a lot of propaganda about the Chinese penetration of the continent, and I think quite a bit of exaggeration. The types of stories we've heard in the newspapers is that China has sent out some of its prisoners who've been sent to Africa. So we've had a lot of that noise, which I think has colored, the more scientific interpretation of what's going on.
Since both of you said something in the same logic, that there were misperceptions, there were propaganda against the Chinese presence in Africa, but many would really wonder genuinely, why?
I think part of the problem is also that it is, for many countries, the first time that they confront the presence of Chinese firms in new sectors. So it's also an issue with the new sectors and the kinds of work cultures that come with the new sectors. Unfortunately, there is always a tendency in media towards what we call a methodological nationalism. So things that are basically intrinsic to, for example, industrial capitalism, industrial work, they are then linked to the nation, the origin of firms, whether these are Chinese or Indian and so on. And that's, I guess, because it sells more. These kinds of news sell more. I mean, if you say that they found prison labor in Chinese firms, this is something that is going to make the news. Whereas if you basically tell a sort of mundane story about normal working conditions in Chinese work sites, this is not going to sell in some newspaper or media outlets.
But the other thing is why people would believe if these were propaganda. Was there, shall we say, fertile ground for this, or rich ground for propaganda to spread around about the Chinese presence in Africa? And why is that, Mr. Sachu?
Things have changed, but 20 years ago the Chinese point of view was not being carried on this continent. The media structure was such that it favored more the Western perception. And I think now with the advance of the likes of yourselves, your presence here in Nairobi, there is much more balance. And I think that's a function of the world that we live in today. This is not a unique phenomena vis-à-vis China. It was a phenomena that affected many of the emerging market countries who lacked a voice. It was, and therefore we saw this big drive amongst the Chinese, the Russians, to create their own media in order to represent themselves better. So I think what we're watching, we've moved from a much more unipolar world 20 years ago to a multipolar world today.
As you may know, technology is developing very fast, and now we're already hearing, you know, one small country in the world is totally covered by 5G, for example. That's how fast we're talking about. And Africa could have this frog leap effect in a way, because you do not have to go through all the stages the other economy had to went through, and now you can have this leapfrog stage. So what does that mean? Will Chinese businesses and foreign investors be able to provide Africa with an extra opportunity like that?
Take Kenya, for example, where we have an incredibly fast internet. You know, for $50 a month, I can stream anything. It's just quite extraordinary. So you're completely correct. I think the next revolution that we're going to see is around this digital internet type economy. This was the point Jack Ma made of Alibaba when he visited Nairobi and people were complaining about the state of our roads, and he turned to everybody and said, but you've got the fastest internet. That's the 21st century infrastructure that you need. So I think you're completely correct. The leapfrog, you know, theoretically, if you look back at China's history, very similar to what we're seeing happen here. Deng Xiaoping, you know, became a low-cost manufacturing base, invited in foreign capital, what was that, 30, 40 years ago, and look at where you are now. So I think there's an opportunity to actually compress what China experienced into a shorter space of time here on the continent, and I think China has an important catalytic role to play in that compression and in that leapfrog.
And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, as we all know, is in a way playing a role trying to bridge all the possibilities, but that of course still have a big potential to develop in the future. But before we go, gentlemen, I just want to genuinely ask an important question. Probably it's a question also in the minds of many of our audience around the world. If you are not talking to CGTN, which is a media organization now headquartered in China, are you going to say the same thing? Or this is very much in a way, a different situation, different interpretation issue? Professor Oya.
Well, no, I mean, I don't shape what I say depending on what media outlet is asking the questions. I mean, we did ask our research questions, we did our research, we got our findings, this is all available, anyone can read our reports and our press release and so on. So the same, you know, I was interviewed by the Financial Times, and this story came out in the Financial Times. Of course, the big challenge is whether media, generally, will be able to provide a fair representation of the findings of research like this. I think that is the first thing. So obviously, I would say the same exactly in any other media outlets. And I think there's an opportunity also for Chinese institutions, authorities, embassies, and so on, to engage with this kind of research, with more objective, rigorous, solid research, so that these kinds of misrepresentations are probed and are challenged by, the actual data that come from the ground.
Thank you, sir.
So
Mr.
this
Satru?
is actually quite important.
Okay, Mr. Satru, what about for you?
I think, the Chinese media itself is sometimes slow to react. I read, for example, the FOCAC speech in 2018 by President Xi Jinping, and he clearly signaled a very major pivot in that speech. He talks about vanity projects, etc., but that was not really picked up. So just to end, to just say, it's also about the type of questions were asked. And then I think, there is a positive story to be told, but we're better off analyzing it as objectively as possible.
Exactly. Ali Khan Satru, Carlos Oya, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your input and your straightforward opinion. Thank you.